for bringing this bill to Parliament's attention. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Eugenie Sage. Tēnā koe, Ms Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Thank you. The Green Party again is pleased to speak to the Conservation Natural Heritage Protection Bill, and this will be a short call on its third reading. I've previously described the bill as useful tinkering, and it's certainly that because it does seek to improve compliance with conservation legislation, and Marion Street enumerated the acts that it applies to, like the Conservation Act, the National Parks Act, the Reserves Act, the Wildlife Act, the Wild Animal Control Act and the Marine Mammals Protection Act. And it does this in terms of attempting to improve compliance by increasing the penalties, both in terms of imprisonment and the fine, and providing for a more flexible sentencing regime. And certainly there needed to be legislative change, because a lot of the penalties in the legislation are quite old. In the Reserves Act, for example, they hadn't been changed since 1977. They're inconsistent. The same offence in different types of protected area can end up with different penalties. They're often not proportionate to the significance of the wildlife. People who are smuggling our species like gecko could earn more from selling gecko internationally than they would be penalised under the Wildlife Act. So it was quite problematic, these pieces of legislation and the enforcement and penalty regime that they established. So we do congratulate Jackie Dean for her work in bringing this bill to the House and to Select Committee, and for the very constructive way in which the Select Committee operated. And it's also useful legislation because the Department has reported a number of offences in areas as diverse as encroachments on conservation land, illegal whitebaiting, people taking dogs into areas that are closed to dogs in order to protect the kiwi there, people injuring wildlife. In the case of the bashing of the seals that Marion Street referred to, I think it was actually a prosecution under the Animal Welfare Act rather than conservation legislation. But all of these sorts of things happen on conservation lands and to our protected species, and people need to know that there are strong penalties and that they will be dealt with appropriately. But, Mr Speaker, there are some wider problems with the actual implementation of this bill, and that's because of the significant underfunding of the Department of Conservation and the restructuring of the department. It's moved away from being a place-based organisation centred around field centres, area offices and conservancies to having much bigger regions. And I question whether there will be enough staff on the ground and they will have the capacity to actually respond promptly to potential breaches of the legislation. Certainly DOC has a hotline that the public can report anything that looks a bit dubious to, report registration numbers, so the public do have a key role in providing the department's eyes and ears. But when you have a department that has had its funding cut by $54 million under this government, does it have the resources to ensure that staff are out there in the field, vigilant about potential offences, and that the department then prosecutes those potential offenders? Because we've seen in the Ruataniwha case the department saying that one of the reasons it didn't make a proper submission was because it was concerned about the cost of bringing expert witnesses and others in front of the Board of Inquiry. So cost is used to undermine the department's statutory advocacy responsibilities. How do we know that it's not going to do the same here, that there is a risk that it won't be enforcing the legislation and these increased penalties? The other area where there's a major concern is that the government has not shown itself committed to the effective management of our natural heritage. Here you have a new offence created, or new penalties created, for offences like affecting the spawning areas of fish, for putting substances or devices in the water that will harm fish, and yet you don't have the same department that's responsible for enforcing this legislation being able to make a substantive submission on the Ruataniwha Dam application, which will make the Tukituki River and other tributaries potentially toxic because of elevated nitrate levels and kill fish. So we have it being an offence to kill fish, increased penalties under this bill, but the department not being active to prevent a major irrigation scheme that will kill fish. So there's a double standard there, Mr Speaker. And yet you have the Ministry of Primary Industry in that same Ruataniwha case making an 18-page submission about how the scheme will benefit agriculture, but you don't have DOC doing its work. So this government isn't interested in the department doing its job properly. And we've seen that through the major cuts to funding and through the significant restructuring in the department. And it is true, and it's borne out by the department's annual report, which was tabled last week. Under that annual report, it highlights that we've got a biodiversity crisis in New Zealand, which the government is blind to. DOC gets $157 million annually. That's all for natural heritage management. It was only able to do possum control last year on 184,000 hectares. So yes, this bill is a good one in terms of improving the penalties, but the wider issue of effectively managing our conservation lands, adequately funding the department to do comprehensive pest control is not being given the attention that it deserves or the funding that it deserves by the government. So you have the department hemorrhaging staff as a result of the restructuring. So will there be the staff on the ground to recognise when offences are occurring? Will they follow up those offences? We're not sure because of the major loss of expertise, of staff numbers and the move away from a place-based department, and because of the department's failure to undertake its statutory responsibilities in terms of statutory advocacy and freshwater fish management. So yes, the bill is a good one, but it is a small area that it's dealing with, and there may not be the adequate funding for the department to undertake its compliance and enforcement responsibilities effectively. Mr Chair.
Well, order.